After further research, it appears that my original idea about several independent organizations turned out to be just two main ones, both sited in the US, namely the Apache Point Observatory Lunar Laser Ranging Operation, APOLLO, located in New Mexico, and the McDonald Laser Ranging Station, MLRS. As soon as I saw that acronym, APOLLO, I became suspicious. I was right to be somewhat suspicious. The Apollo facility was largely funded by the Microgravity Division of NASA. Apollo is a collaboration between several universities, a few scientific institutions, and the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. What really surprised me was that the facility did not become operational until 2005. I have no idea what happened in the 36 years since the Apollo 11 astronauts supposedly placed the retroreflectors on the moon. According to the International Laser Ranging Service, ILRS, there are about 40 institutions throughout the world involved in laser ranging, but in 2015, only the two US sited mentioned above and the Observatoire de la Côte d'Azur, France, that were technically equipped to carry out laser ranging, LLR, to retroreflector arrays on the surface of the moon. However, all of this may be immaterial. It transpires that you do not need retroreflectors to bounce signals off of the moon. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Crimean Astrophysical University were both firing lasers at the moon and receiving a return signal in 1962, long before any reflectors were supposedly installed on the moon by the Apollo missions. Also, both the American and British military were beaming radio signals at the moon and receiving return signals in the late 1940s, so there is no apparent reason why signals, radio or laser, cannot be bounced off the moon with no special reflectors, providing that there is a large enough collection dish on the Earth to receive the greatly diminished return signals. An interesting technical paper has been produced by Andreas Marquis of the Swiss Federal Institution of Technology. Although the contents of this paper are highly technical, it does provide some relative conclusions. The paper examines the direct reflected light from the Apollo retroreflector as well as the scattered light from the lunar surface. In summary, the paper finds minimal evidence that the laser reflections obtained from the moon's surface are specifically from those retroreflectors. The author states, "The only indication of a retroreflector was the signature of the return signal, i.e. its small variance. But a small variance would also appear in a measurement onto a lunar surface which is perpendicular to the measurement direction." And commenting on a statement made in a scientific paper by J.O. Dickey from the National Jet Propulsion Laboratory, all of this together with the measurement result may call the following statement into question. These retroreflector arrays are still operating normally after 25 years. His final conclusion is even more damning. According to the number of return photons, I can go even further and conclude that in all lunar laser ranging experiments, the measurements were taken to the bare surface of the moon. I am not a brilliant mathematician, but let's do some simple maths. Now, the laser beam when it reached the moon is not a pinpoint of light, but the laser light has divergence to have a large radius when it hits the lunar surface. The Lunar Planetary Institute (LPI) website states, "Laser beams are used because they remain tightly focused for large distances. Nevertheless, when there is enough dispersion of the beam, that is about 7 kilometers in diameter when it reaches the moon and 20 kilometers in diameter when it returns to Earth." Wikipedia states that the diameter when the beam reaches the moon is 6.5 kilometers. However, we will use the LPI figure of 7 kilometers diameter, which is 3.5 kilometers or 3,500 meters in radius. The area in square meters covered by the laser beam is pi squared, that is pi times the radius squared. That figure is 3.14 times 3,500 squared, or 38,484,510 square meters. That is over 38 million square meters. The size of the retroreflector, Apollo 11 and 14, was 0.61 meters by 0.61 meter, so the area is 0.732 square meters. Now let's do some real maths. In the area illuminated by the laser light, the retroreflector represents a very small percentage of that area. 100 times 0.372 divided by 38,484,510%, which equals 0.0000967%. If the retroreflector is present in the area illuminated by the laser, it will only receive a minuscule part of the laser signal and cannot send back any more than it received. Now it gets even worse as the return laser beam has a diameter of about 20 kilometers when the signal is reflected back to the Earth. That is a vast area of 314,155,265,358,979 square meters. The receiving telescope tube at the McDonald Observatory has a diameter of 85.95 centimeters, so a surface area of 2.32 square meters. The collection area is therefore just a small percentage of the area covered by the return laser beam. If you wish to do the calculation, it is 100 times 2.32 divided by 314,155,265,358,979%. That would mean that a photon aimed at the moon would be received back on Earth with an effectively 0.0. They fire 10 to the 17 photons in each test, which would be on average give a return of less than 1 photon using the percentage figures calculated above. Apparently, they usually receive no photons returned, but sometimes 1 photon is returned. So they need to make many observations over a period of time to finally get the 3,000 photons that they need to make an accurate measurement. The LPI also states that because of this very weak signal, observations are made for several hours at a time. By averaging the signal for this period, the distance to the moon can be measured to an accuracy about 3 centimeters. The average distance from the Earth to the moon is about 385,000 kilometers. Now, I may not be the greatest scientist, but I thought that the moon relative to the Earth was in constant motion, so what exactly are they measuring over a period of several hours? Also, they have no idea where the returned photons have come from. It could be from the retroreflectors, but more probably from the surface of the moon. The retroreflectors on Apollo 15 were 3 times as large as the ones on Apollo 11 and 14, but quite honestly, does it really affect the maths? It is more than likely that any light returning from the moon as a result of the laser is just a reflection from the lunar surface, either from the mountain tops or the deep valley, so how can this measure the distance to the constantly moving moon? A further relative point is that NASA appears not to know quite exactly where the Apollo landing sites are, which I find quite surprising. I would have thought that NASA would know exactly where their spacecraft had landed on the historical landings on the moon, but it seems not. NASA gives several different coordinates for each of the Apollo missions, the worst being for Apollo 11, which has 2 locations differing by 20 kilometers. The details are given in the paper by Michael Steniken, Lost Lunar Landing Sites, the CLLC Initiative. The data on the following 2 pages is extracted from that paper. Note that the 8 of the 10 sources quoted for the Apollo landing coordinates are from NASA themselves. Now, how did these seemingly lost Apollo sites affect the lunar ranging exercise? Well, the retroreflectors were left on Apollo missions 11, 14, and 17, and you can see in the table above that the exact location of these sites is somewhat dubious. If this is the case, then you are left wondering at what heavenly point that they are aiming the laser beam. I firmly believe that the laser ranging idea of placing retroreflectors on the moon by the Apollo astronauts was just another ploy by NASA to try and prove that the fake Apollo missions were real. The logic behind accurately measuring the distance between the constantly moving Earth and the moon to a few centimeters is completely ridiculous, as the measurements need to be carried out for a period of several hours in order to collect enough returned photons to get an accurate measurement. There is no way it can be known where these returned photons are coming from, the surface of the moon or from the retroreflector. The laser retroreflector argument is absolutely no proof that man landed on the moon. Likewise, the fact that laser beams can be bounced off the moon without any laser retroreflectors does not in any way disprove the Apollo moon landings. However, the fact that NASA continues to defend the laser retroreflectors as proof that the Apollo astronauts went to the moon, for me, is indicative of manifest deceit. The very idea of being able to produce extremely accurate measurements of this distance between the Earth and the Moon over a period of several hours while the Earth and the Moon are in constant relative motion is just totally ludicrous. Conclusions. It appears that none of these four self-evident assertions by the pro-NASA group can be taken as conclusive evidence that the Apollo missions were real. No doubt they will be repeated over and over again by the NASA devotees, I guess eagerly encouraged by NASA. The simple fact is that they have no solid basis when examined in detail. Creating the evidence. The best is yet to come. William Shakespeare, Twelfth Night. As we have passed the 50th anniversary of the faked Apollo 11 moon landing, it is time to expose the deceit for what it really is. In this vein, there was a moon celebration week in London and many others around the globe. Unfortunately, it never happened in the way in which NASA claims. It is now beyond any reasonable doubts, and only the pro-NASA diehards can desperately cling onto the illusion that it actually happened. In this video, we will examine the methods used by the clandestine group within NASA to cleverly construct the deceit which has fooled the world for half a century and probably will still fool half the world for another 50 years. How to approach the problem. Imagine that you are asked to design, plan, and produce the hoax. What would you need and how could you do it? That was the critical question that NASA X must have faced back in the early mid-1960s. Would it be possible to completely fake the moon landings? How can you fool the whole world live on television? And how could you hope to keep such a monumental secret? The Apollo missions must be successful. There was too much at stake for it to fail. It was a matter of national prestige, not to mention its importance in the Cold War and the alleged competition with the Soviet Union. The risks on relying on the science and technology to achieve a successful outcome were too immense, and the possibility of failure could not be countenanced. Fakery could be used to ensure success. What you also need to bear in mind is that the real Apollo missions were being designed, planned, and programmed by dedicated scientists on the assumption that NASA would be able to get men to the moon. We therefore have two programs running in parallel, the real scientific NASA working hard to achieve the moon landings, and the NASA X clandestine group working parallel to NASA to ensure that it was achieved by fakery. This second project has been referred to as the Apollo Simulation Project, ASP, by the well-known late skeptic Bill Kaysing. The problems involved in the faking of the Apollo missions were immense. It was to be a hoax on a grand scale perpetrated in front of the entire world. When I first looked in detail at the NASA archive, I was totally disbelieving it could have been possible to produce so much factual evidence, an assertion continuously echoed by the pro-NASA group. There appears to be far too much detailed information in the form of mission transcripts, second-by-second dialogue between the astronauts and mission control, hours of video footage, and thousands of photographs. How could this have been fabricated and stitched together in so much minute detail? This is one of the main arguments in defense of NASA by the pro-NASA devotees who claim that it would have been easier to actually go to the moon than to attempt to fake it. This actually assumes that going to the moon was a realistic and viable option, and this was extremely doubtful. One of the strongest arguments for this is the fact that after the Apollo missions, no nation has ever attempted to go to the moon during the intervening 50 years. There is no question that if the Apollo missions had been real, then there would have been many like missions to the moon, and the exploration of the moon would now be commonplace, but it is not. Now, as we observe the current efforts of NASA, then we see that getting to the moon is not such an easy task. Beginning the fakery. NASA X clearly infiltrated NASA from the very beginning. They would have had operatives employed by NASA at all levels, even to the highest echelons of the organization. This is common practice for the CIA, DIA in all theaters of operation. If you are to convince the world that you have landed men on the moon, then you need to have some solid evidence to prove it. So what evidence would you need, and how could you fabricate it? At a minimum, you would need to have the following: 1. Video of the Saturn V rocket leaving Earth. 2. TV shots of astronauts in the space capsule to demonstrate weightlessness in low Earth orbit and translunar coast. 3. Audio of astronauts talking to mission control with the appropriate time delays relative to the distance from Earth. 4. Video of the Earth seen from deep space through the capsule window. 5. Video of the lunar module landing on the moon through the capsule window. 6. The most conclusive piece of evidence would be live TV pictures from the moon showing the astronauts walking in lunar gravity. It would be essential to provide some calculable proof of the moon's gravity, say by astronauts dropping lots of things, jumping up and down, and the odd pendulum demonstration. 7. Some lunar rocks and dust brought back by the astronauts from the moon. 8. Photographs of astronauts on the moon, but best not get carried away to produce too many. 9. Some conclusive proof that you have been there, such as leaving some retroreflectors and other equipment that could continue to be used after the astronauts left. 10. Videos of the lunar module ascent stage blasting off from the moon. 11. Videos showing redocking of the ascent stage of the lunar module with the command module. 12. Video of the capsule landing in the sea on its return to Earth. 13. And finally, a press conference to hear the astronauts' story of the adventure. So there you have it. Lots to do, but if you could accomplish these aspects, then you are well on your way to faking it. We will now examine what NASA X did and how well they did it. Saturn V rocket leaving Earth. The development of the Saturn V rocket was not without its problems, but finally it launched on 9 November 1967. It surprised everyone who was present at the Cape Canaveral launch site with a tremendous force. It shook whole buildings and smashed nearby windows with the force of a small earthquake. Wernher von Braun, the chief NASA rocket scientist, took a conservative approach to his rockets and wanted to cautiously test each one of the 3 parts of the rocket separately. His way was to over-design and build rockets that were more sturdy than was perhaps necessary. This philosophy took its toll on NASA's early efforts, and they did not have the luxury of timing with the end of a decade lunar landing deadline that was fast approaching. The Saturn V rocket was the only machine to get them there. George Mueller, who headed the Office of the Manned Spaceflight, realized that NASA would never make it to the moon by the end of the decade without a new, more forceful approach to its rocket development program. He called for NASA to adopt an all-up approach to its rocket tests. Rather than testing the components separately, the standard approach in NASA's early days, he wanted von Braun to test the full rocket all in one go. He also insisted that the first flight of the Saturn V was to carry a fully functional Apollo command and service module as payloads so their systems could be tested in orbit. The mission would follow a trajectory that would have the command module re-enter the atmosphere as though it were returning from the moon, adding a heat shield test to the program. It is said that Mueller's design ultimately saved the Saturn V program. Designated Apollo 4, the first Saturn V launch was a stunning success. Only Apollo 6 saw another unmanned Saturn V launch. Quite amazingly, the third Saturn rocket NASA ever launched supposedly took the Apollo 8 crew to the moon in December of 1968. We have more discussion on the capabilities of the Saturn V rocket in the next section when we will discuss how far the astronauts actually went. Videos of weightlessness in space. Perhaps one of the most convincing images of space is to see astronauts in the weightless environment of the spacecraft. We have mentioned before that they are not actually weightless, but simply in constant freefall under the force of gravity. If you wish to watch the videos of the astronauts in the space capsule, then on some occasions they are empathizing the weightlessness aspect by doing pointless tricks with various floating objects such as food morsels, pens, or notebooks. This concentration on showing weightlessness was an important aspect of the NASA X fakery. On other occasions, you see nothing of weightlessness, just 2 or 3 men riding in odd positions about the capsule, presumably to give the impression of them being weightless. I had always assumed that the Apollo astronauts on all missions had at least reached low Earth orbit, but there appears to be some evidence that on some missions they didn't even leave the Earth. In his book, We Never Went to the Moon, Bill Kaysing suggests that no Apollo missions went into low Earth orbit and that all of the Saturn V rockets reached an untimely end in the deep Atlantic Ocean. I understand that he later revised his view on this, but he certainly was on the opinion that the Apollo 15 astronauts never left the ground. It must be remembered that at that time, Bill Kaysing was writing. There was no internet and no wealth of information available on the Apollo missions. Bill Kaysing's book is revealing for many other reasons. It was first penned in 1974 and first self-published in 1976. It was later republished by Health Resources Books in 2002. It is a fascinating and quite detailed expose of the Apollo fakery, which Kaysing refers to as the Apollo Simulation Project, ASP. Skeptic Gerard White takes up the story about how far the Apollo astronauts went. He has examined the videos of the astronauts shown in weightless conditions in the capsule in his two-part series. He points out that on Apollo 10 and 11 missions, blue light is noticeable through the capsule windows, which he suggests indicates that the capsule was actually in low Earth orbit, even though it was claimed by NASA to be halfway to the moon in the blackness of space. In Apollo 15, he shows that none of the capsule video sequences lasts more than 30 seconds, which he maintains could have been filmed in the KC-135 aircraft, affectionately known as the Vomit Comet. So Gerard's conclusion seems to be that after Apollo 11, there were no astronauts in the capsule. His reasoning is that after Apollo 11, NASA had fulfilled Kennedy's goal to get men to the moon, so it was no longer necessary to risk the possibility of some of the rockets or the other equipment malfunctioning. I have just read an interesting article in the Nexus magazine by Randy Walsh entitled Moon Missions Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Randy looks at the evidence surrounding the power of the Saturn V rocket. He shows amateur footage of the Saturn V liftoff from Cape Canaveral for Apollo 11, which has now been made into a video series. His interpretation of the evidence indicates that the Saturn V rocket could not have achieved sufficient thrust to have reached the optimal orbit for the translunar blast to the moon, and consequently that means that none of the Apollo missions could have gone to the moon. This is the conflict with the blue light showing the capsule, which Gerard White pointed out in his video. If NASA X had staged that video on Earth, then why would they purposefully use blue light through the windows when it should have been the blackness of deep space? I think that it must have been in low Earth orbit and that NASA X simply forgot the finer details of what space should look like. So we seem to have very conflicting information about how far the Apollo astronauts actually went and how many of them reached low Earth orbit. It is perhaps academic, as it does not in any way distract from the main essence of the deception. What we do know for certain is that they never went to the moon. Audio of astronauts talking to mission control. Communication between mission control is to be expected throughout the Apollo mission. NASA had simulated all the aspects of the mission many times as part of the astronaut training regime. They would therefore have had ample audio tapes to use to make up the transmitted audio. What they did not have, they could easily fabricate. There was, however, one aspect of the audio transmissions that NASA originally overlooked. The transmission signal used for the audio conversation was radio waves which travel at the speed of light, an astonishing 186,000 miles per second. So light would travel 7.5 times around the Earth in 1 second. The Moon is about 240,000 miles from the Earth, so any signal would take about 1.3 seconds to reach Earth. That is 240,000 divided by 186,000 equals 1.29 seconds. So when an astronaut on the Moon speaks, it takes 1.3 seconds before Mission Control in Houston will hear him. Likewise, when Mission Control asks the astronaut a question, then it must be a minimum of 2.6 seconds before he gets a reply, that is 1.3 seconds for the signal to reach the astronaut on the Moon, and 1.3 seconds for the return signal to be received back on Earth, assuming the astronaut replies instantly. Normally, there should be a slight longer delay as the astronaut absorbs the question and formulates his response. In some of the original NASA audio, this necessary time gap according to the laws of physics was not there. For example, watch this first TV transmission from the moon on Apollo 11. At 26 seconds in, you hear Mission Control comment,
"I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene."
That comment ends at 30 seconds. At 31 seconds, we hear the astronaut on the moon reply, but that is after only 1 second.
"That's all right, I don't mind a bit."
This is physically impossible. The astronaut is answering before he could have even received the message.
"I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene." "That's all right, I don't mind a bit."
There is no confusion here, as we can definitely see that the astronaut is replying to that specific question. When NASA had this problem pointed out by the skeptics, they produced an edited version on the 17th of July 2014 with the correct time delays added. This new version is referred to as being a restored video, whatever that means, but it also is an edited version, as you can clearly hear if you listen from times 47.13 to 49.00, when you will hear that repeated echoes are used to add extra time in the delay. You can hear this obvious correction clearly at the very beginning of this video from NBC News.
Hey, we got a picture, 17. We have a picture.
Yep. Oh, beautiful, babe. It's all yours. I hope it moves now.
It does.
I hope it moves.
This editing of the original video is described by Hunchbacked.
Probably like to get you going. You didn't get the clue.
No. Put on. Okay.
Probably like to get you going. You didn't get the clue.
No. Put on. Okay.
This fact alone is undeniable proof of NASA's fakery and that they are attempting to correct the oversights in the 1969 deceit.
John suggests we might just check it momentarily while you're here to make sure it's still holding on good and tight. Both the clamps and the tape.
Yeah, that's on my list.
John suggests we might just check it momentarily while you're here to make sure it's still holding on good and tight. Both the clamps and the tape.
Yeah, that's on my list.
Video of the Earth seen from space. A necessary shot we would all expect was the iconic view of our distant Earth as the spacecraft was well on its way to the moon. This would be the absolute proof that the mission was real, so it was essential that NASA provide this view of the Earth, but its efforts were not all that successful, as we will see. This renowned view of Earth from the space capsule, as it was allegedly about halfway to the moon, is covered in this famous Bart Sibrel film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, first released in April of 2000. The video lasts 47 minutes and is well worth watching. In the video, it is claimed that NASA sent Bart Sibrel an old film reel by mistake, which shows an unscheduled TV transmission in which the astronauts are filming the Earth through the space capsule window. According to Bart Sibrel, this video shows the astronauts falsely staging the view of a distant Earth through the capsule window when they are only in fact in low Earth orbit and not halfway to the moon as NASA disingenuously claimed. The real importance of this video lies in the discovery of a third voice in the communication loop. According to NASA, only two parties were involved in the communication, the astronauts and Mission Control in Houston, but we hear a third voice distinctly different from the other two. It is just one word, given in the form of a command to Neil Armstrong. This is clear proof that a third clandestine party was involved in controlling the sequence of events. It is important that you see this video out in its entirety without any narration, just the conversation between Houston and the Apollo astronauts. From this, you can better form your own opinion on what is going on. Bart Sibrel's explanation of what is going on is just an interpretation, but Jera White has another. I present Jera White's explanation in full. Over the past few months, I have received many emails from people asking me to comment on various videos uploaded by the Pro-NASA site. Specifically, they ask me, how can the Apollo 11 views of Earth be a transparency over the window as stated by Bart Sibrel and David Percy, when one shot shows the Earth vanishing behind the windows? I explained this way back in 2007, but unfortunately, it seems that the propagandists' misinterpretation of the footage continues to this day. I am also asked how NASA got the cloud formations right if these videos were faked. Apparently, the cloud formations seen in these telecasts are similar to those seen by weather satellites. Firstly, the Apollo 11 crew made not one, but 4 television broadcasts during the coast phase in their alleged voyage to the moon. According to Spacecraft Films DVD, the first one was filmed at 10:32 GET, ground elapsed time 10 hours 32 minutes after the start of the mission. The second was filmed at 30:28 GET, and the third at 33:59 GET, and the fourth was filmed at 55:08 GET. The first, third, and fourth broadcasts were all a continuous video with no edits. But the second video, the one where the Earth clearly disappears behind the window, is just a jumble of random interior and exterior shots. The astronauts don't even appear in the same shot as the Earth vanishing behind the window. In fact, if you actually watch these in-flight television transmissions closely, you'll notice that the astronauts are never in the same shot as the Earth. The camera always blacks out to a cutaway between interior and exterior shots. In the film industry, this is called smoke and mirrors. Anyways, long story short, Bart Sibrel and David Percy discussed the 10:32 GET and the 33:59 GET telecasts in their respective documentaries. These are the 2 broadcasts that they say were filmed with a transparency. In response to the transparency claim, the 30:28 GET telecasts have been flogged by members of the pro-NASA side over and over again as though all 4 videos were the same telecast, and not once do they reveal that it is in fact an edited video. For the record, I believe that these videos in which the Earth disappeared behind the window were filmed in a CSM mock-up with an accurate globe on the outside. At the request of a certain YouTube user who has been confused by the pro-NASA side's representation of these videos, I am uploading all 4 from start to finish. Secondly, these videos have been compared with the photos of Earth taken by weather satellites in orbit at the time. Naturally, the pro-NASA side has been very quick to call this evidence. This trait is typical among propagandists. They present a piece of data or video that they don't know how to fake, and they assume that everything they don't know how to fake must be evidence that Apollo was real. Considering that NASA had many weather satellites in orbit long before and during Apollo, and that meteorologists have been using such satellite photographs to predict cloud formations and thus make forecasts of the week's weather, I'd say that's how NASA was able to get the cloud positions right in these videos. Thirdly, I have also been asked why Sibrel says the telecasts that NASA sent him were classified when they are available on Spacecraft Films DVD set. The footage that Sibrel received carried this title card: "This film of the Apollo 11 mission was produced as a report film by the Manned Spacecraft Center and is not for general public distribution." Furthermore, NASA sent Sibrel this footage in 2000. Spacecraft Films published this copy of it in 2002. It seems to me that NASA decided to classify this footage after Bart Sibrel leaked it. Jera White has posted a video showing his opinion of the TV transmissions, in which he also comments on the Bart Sibrel video, and he subsequently posted an addendum to this video. Now, I need to admit that all of this is quite complex and not that simple to comprehend. In the first video, Jera expresses doubts about the dating of the video as shown on the title slate. These doubts appear to be based on the date a newspaper article was published in Australia showing an image of the distant Earth from the Apollo 11 capsule, which Jera claims was published before the actual TV transmission. In Jera's second video, which is titled Moonfaker, Exhibit B, Corrections and Revisions, he attempts to simplify his point about the dating of the video. It appears to depend on how NASA counts the first day of the mission as either day 0 or day 1. I am not entirely sure what relevance all of this has, but I believe that he is perhaps trying to suggest that the video may have been made sometime before the Apollo missions and therefore must be fake.